As a trauma survivor, I have always been interested in resilience. But growing up, I believed it was something that you were born with. Then in graduate school, I learned that it was a quality that we all possess and a set of skills we can all strengthen. Most of my resilience has come from writing and seeing myself in new ways by confronting the stories I've always told myself. The more I did that, the stronger I became, and I've dedicated my life to helping others do this work. This podcast is for anyone who wants to understand their story and how to revise it, because when we do that work, we change the world. Has anyone ever told you to add more emotions to the tough scenes in your memoir? What if you don't have access to those feelings, especially when it comes to the big traumas you're writing about? Or what if you don't know how to write about them? Do you need to share this with readers, or are there tricks you can learn that will help you write emotionally about traumatic events without re traumatizing yourself? These are a few of the questions I'll explore with writer, spiritual director, and recovering lawyer Deborah Svec-Carstens on this week's episode of the Writing Your Resilience podcast. Let's dive in. Hey, writers, have you written a draft or two of a memoir only to feel completely lost? Do you wonder what the story really is or how to structure it? Or have you received competing advice from some people who love certain parts of your story while others don't? Or worst of all, have you been ghosted by agents and editors or received the cryptic, great writing, but just not for us email? Most writers think the answer is diving deeply into their pages. But to figure out what's missing, what needs to be retooled, and what needs to be tossed, you need a bird's eye view of your manuscript. That's what I'll provide in Camp Structure, my proven program that will help you understand how stories work, decide what parts of your life actually belong in your book, and develop a clear path through the revision landmines most memoirists face. As a member of Camp Structure, you'll benefit from expert coaching, membership in a motivated cohort, monthly Ask Me Anything office hours, and instruction that will help you finish this book and the next one. So if you want to feel confident about the story you're telling, clarity around how to write it, and the focus needed to get the job done, sign up for Camp Structure by clicking on the link in the show notes. Camp begins on Tuesday, September 10th, which will be here before you know it, so be sure to grab your spot. Well, hello, Deborah. I am so glad that you are on the Writing Your Resilience podcast. Welcome.
Well, thanks, Lisa. I'm so glad to be here. Thanks so much for having me.
Well, thank you for being one of my newsletter followers. And I'm really excited to dive into this question. But before we get to it, can you tell us a little about you and your writing project?
A little bit about me. After a 20-year career as a government lawyer, I returned to graduate school, earned a Master of Theological Studies, and I'm now working as a writer, a freelance editor, and a spiritual director. I often get a lot of questions, what is a spiritual director? So the brief explanation is that I offer a non-judgmental space of deep listening where others can explore their questions and make meaning of their life experiences. And I work primarily with women who have experienced trauma or women who are in transition, whether that's due to some kind of career change, loss of a loved one, children leaving for college, something like that. My project, I have written a memoir. It's called Toward the Light, A Year in Paris, and it focuses on the beginning of healing after trauma. When I was 22, I was a recent college graduate living with my parents and feeling directionless. I decided to escape small town Iowa for a year-long adventure as a nanny in Paris. And 2 months after my arrival, a stranger sexually assaulted me after my morning run in the Bois de Boulogne. I was isolated and alone in a foreign country in the early 1990s, but unwilling to admit defeat or abandon the family I worked for. So I chose to stay in France and begin again, seeking healing and transforming myself in the process. And the book invites readers along on my search for meaning, community, and connection in the months following the assault. I'm currently in the process of querying agents. I've had writing published in the Des Moines Register and been named a finalist for Women on Writing Creative Nonfiction Essay Contests. I've had an essay named a notable essay for a Me Too contest in Memoir magazine. And earlier this year, I appeared before an audience of about 1,200 people as part of the Des Moines Storytellers Project and shared my story of creating community in the aftermath of sexual assault.
So, first, congratulations on all of those many awards and accolades. That is wonderful. And kudos for such a great description of your project. I
Oh,
mean,
thank,
it's so hard for writers to figure out how to do this, and you just did it marvelously. Bravo.
thank you.
Also, I want to say thank you for the work that you do in the world. You know, a lot of people have been damaged by organized religion. They've had very difficult experiences, a lot of harm has happened. And yet, our spirituality, which to me is how we make meaning, where we find hope in the world, and really how do we see things, is so important. And we need to be able to talk about what that is for us in a non judgmental space where someone's not going to say, oh, join this, do this, whatever. And I love that that is part of what you do in the world.
It's something that I really enjoy, and I get as much out of it as hopefully the people that I'm working with. And I do think it's important for people to have that space to be able to question and just wonder about what is a meaningful life for them and where they find
Yes,
meaning.
absolutely. So, a lot of what we do on this podcast is figuring out how to make meaning, and we address people's questions in order to figure that out. And you have a very important question for us today. Would you like to share it?
So my question is that in my writing, when I'm sharing it with other people, I routinely receive feedback that my writing needs more emotion.
Mm.
So I've heard this throughout writing my memoir and now as I'm focused on writing essays. So I'm wondering, what are some tips and tricks to bring more emotion to the page, especially when you're writing about trauma or other challenging life events?
Yeah. Thank you for that question. So many people have it. You are definitely not alone on that one. And it was something that I had to figure out myself. So I'm also, my heart is connecting to yours as you share that because it's really tough. So I want to begin by just giving an overview of some of the very common ways that this struggle shows up in writing and why we struggle with it. So sometimes for some people, we don't have the language to describe our emotions. Maybe we never learned it. Maybe we grew up in an invalidating environment where emotions weren't talked about. Sometimes people who are neurodivergent don't have the language to talk about emotions. So then when people are asking us to do this, it can feel like a foreign language. And I know that may not be your issue, but I just kind of want to go through the ones that happen. So that's one thing is, do we understand what emotions are and do we understand what it's like to feel them in the here and now? Then there can be events that happen in our life, whether they happen in childhood or they happen in our adult lives, that are traumatic. They affect our nervous systems. And when we go through really difficult things, the brain does this magnificent thing. It shuts things down so that you can focus on survival. Feelings are often not needed in the midst of survival. So, if we have divorced ourselves from an experience for the sake of survival, it can be really difficult to add in what we were feeling at the time because it's possible we were feeling nothing. And then sometimes we don't have memories of the event. So that's a third thing that can happen. So maybe we remember the event completely, and yet there are no feelings associated with it. And then sometimes there are gaps in the experience where perhaps the feelings might have existed or parts of the experience aren't there, and that's because when we go through traumatic experiences, the brain does not record everything. It records what seems most important to survival. And so it is very common for, especially if you're dealing with what would be a flash memory of something that's really traumatic, you remember vividly one, two, or three things, often in the beginning, and then there can be this blank spot. And it would take me too long to explain why all that happens in this podcast episode, which is meant to be shorter. So I won't get into that today. But is any of this ringing a bell for you, or how does this show up when you're getting feedback?
Actually, all three of those things that you
Mm.
mentioned. Identifying the feelings is
Mm-hmm.
hard. Identifying or describing how it feels in my body and just putting words on that is hard. Memory is an issue because, especially in writing my memoir, I'm writing about things that happened years ago, and so
Yeah.
remembering some of those things is difficult. And now I've forgotten what the third thing was that you said, but it resonated as well.
That our minds, our
Oh, that
brains
our
shut
minds shut
down.
down.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. that resonated as well, that our minds shut down. And it's hard to pull up those emotions.
Absolutely. And so I have lots of tools and I'm going to share a number of them today. And what I want you to do as we're sitting here is note which ones seem to speak to you like, oh, yes, that's it. And you may feel this in your body. It may feel like a little bling in your brain. It doesn't matter where it happens. It may just be a thought like, oh, yeah, that seems like it could work. But notice that this is part of the process of connecting with your emotions, is figuring out what you like and what seems like it's going to work. So when it comes to developing the language of emotions, sometimes it's important to read about emotions and just get a primer. So Brené Brown has an excellent primer, The Atlas of the Heart. And in it, it's almost like an encyclopedia of the different emotions you can experience. And she talks about the nuances, like the difference between envy and jealousy, or what compassion actually is, or what is anger. She talks about what it looks like, how it feels, the cognitive expressions of it, all of these different things. And reading things like that can be really helpful. And then reading other people's manuscript. So think about, bestsellers, especially things that, and it doesn't have to just be a bestseller, but a bestseller that speaks to you, where you feel like, oh my gosh, this person knows how to navigate this. Read those sections and look at the kinds of language that they're using. And I'm actually going to suggest you get a practice copy of the book, or you can type this out. And sometimes I think typing it out can be better because you can make the font bigger, right? You're not going to type out the whole book. Okay. So what you want to do is type out a section that is emotionally charged. And then I want you to get out a few different highlighters. And I want you to highlight in one color all of the, physical things that happen. So the facial expressions, the way the body position changes, anything that the person does physically to express emotion, I want you to highlight it. Then I want you to have another highlighter and, point out, what do they say? So what's happening in the dialogue? And so there's a dialogue one. And then I want you to have another one that is looking for emotionally charged verbs. So for instance, I can pick up a pen or I can wrench a pen from somebody's hand. Notice that just that word wrenched, that active verb, has an emotional charge. And so sometimes a way to add more emotion to our work is to think about the verbs that we're using, because that can be helpful. I'm going to share more tips, but I'm wondering if you have any thoughts just from that.
Well, Brené Brown's book is sitting on my shelf. I've read part of it, but not all of it. So that is something to pull off the shelf. I love the idea of typing something out and using highlighters. As a former lawyer, I love highlighting, and especially in different colors. I think that's a great idea of a way to really, really see how a writer is using emotion on the page.
Yes. And there was one last thing I meant to add in terms of, the things that I want you to look for. And the last one is interiority. What is the protagonist or the narrator thinking, right? So what are their thoughts? And you can also highlight, if you want to add another one, feeling words. And if you don't highlight a lot of feeling words, that can also be information. Maybe you don't need to talk about how sad you are, or you don't need to cry so much. I'm not talking about you, but maybe what you need to do is say, okay, I'm not going to cry, but what else expresses sadness? How else does this show up? And pay attention to what writers are doing. So once you've done that, then another thing you can do that can help along with having the language is to see what it looks like. And YouTube is fabulous for this. So if you know of different movie clips where someone is angry or really sad, or, there's a lot of conflict, pull up the clip on YouTube and watch it and pay attention to these things, just one at a time. Like watch the clip and look for facial expressions. Watch the clip, look for what happens in the body. Watch the clip, look for the dialogue. So, you want to pick something that's maybe 5 minutes, and you may watch it 4 or 5 times to pay attention to all the different ways that emotion comes up. Because when you can see it and you have the language for it, that can help you put that all together. So that's if it's just a language or I don't know how to talk about it kind of situation, but I don't know what it feels like or I don't remember, those are different things. And they're very common for people who've experienced traumatic events and people who are trying to write about those traumatic events. So if the situation is, I remember vividly what happened, there are no emotions attached to it, you can say that once. But if your life is a life of dissociation where there are no, there are no feelings, you can't say every time this happens, and my brain shut down, or, and now my feelings ended. Sometimes what's important for the reader is to know, well, how might you be feeling? Because even if you dissociated to a certain extent in your brain, shut down to a certain extent, feelings were still happening, right? There was something behind the curtain that maybe you don't have access to that was still happening. And it was happening in your nervous system because feelings are just energy moving through your nervous system. There are neurochemical things that are happening. So if you feel a certain scene is such that you need to be able to talk about that, think about how you might have been feeling or how you feel about that experience now. If you've worked through this in therapy, what emotion showed up? It's likely that whatever shows up in therapy or when you're talking about this at another time is actually what was behind the curtain at that time. Or you can think about, how might a person going through this have felt? You gather this data so that in the moment you can say something like, I didn't have access to this, but if I did, it probably felt like this. So you can speculate about what you might have been feeling. So speculation is a great tool. So that's what you can do to fill in the gaps. You can also create speculative scenes. For some people, it feels very organizing. It helps them feel like they have control over the process. For other people, it can feel a little triggering because you are reliving it in a slightly different way. And so as you do this work, you would want to pay attention. How am I feeling? Does this feel like a thing I want to do? Does it feel true? Does it feel right? And if it doesn't, stop. But investigating what those feelings might be can be really helpful. But sometimes that's not the way to go. Sometimes, even if we investigate it, it's still not safe to us in the present. Right. So it may have been an unsafe situation in the past where your nervous system and your brain had a great reason for shutting down, but maybe now you feel like you're ready for it, but some part of your brain or nervous system, or maybe the wounded one inside you says it ain't safe. So what do you do in that situation? Something you can do is write around the experience. So that is something that Roxanne Gay does in her memoir, Hunger. She writes around the experience. She does not name the rape early on. She talks around it. So that might be a book to read to see how you can talk around something if you can't talk directly to it. If you want to learn more about speculative scenes, and if you might be thinking like, I'm not going to remember all of this stuff because I'm trying to pay attention to what you're saying. And also, if you're just listening, this is going to be in the show notes. So fear not, I will add all this to the show notes so you'll have it. But, Acetylene Torch Songs, which is Sue Williams Silverman's new book, is amazing. And she talks about speculation. And if you want some great examples of what that looks like when there are no memories or there's a gap, Sarah Perry's book, After the Eclipse, is a great one. And Melanie Brooks also does this at the beginning of A Hard Silence. And I interviewed both of them. So I will also link to those interviews so you can hear what they said about how they did that. So I just shared a whole bunch of information. What's sticking out to you?
That speculation part. And so I'm wondering about in the piece that you're writing, are you saying like, here's what I think it's going to be like, or here's what I think it was? Or is the speculation just part of your process, like getting to the emotions? I don't know if I'm posing that question in a clear way, but I
You are
guess
very
the
clear.
question, if the speculation ends up in your final essay or memoir, or if that's just part of like digging in and trying to excavate those emotions.
It's going to depend on the circumstance. There might be some occasions where you embed the emotions into the scene. But if you're truly speculating, if it's a truly speculative scene, it's important for you as the writer to signal, hey, I'm making some stuff up. I'm guessing here. And so, Melanie does this really well in her book. Sarah does this really well. Sometimes also people will use beautiful metaphors to illustrate what that dissociative state is. So that can be a really beautiful and artful way to talk about it. But yeah, so you want to be able to signal that this is happening. Another book that does this really well is Playing with Dynamite by Sharon Harrigan. She writes actually about scenes where she was not present, things that happened from her past, which is something that Sarah Perry does because they both did a lot of research in order to write these books. And so seeing how they do that, even if what they're talking about is something that's it's not the same kind of speculation, but seeing how they do that and noticing what are their triggers for this is speculation, or I'm getting into the research, I'm sharing something where I wasn't there, that might help you find some very artful ways to introduce this without saying the same thing over and again.
Yeah, that's really helpful.
So, what do you think you're going to take from this?
Oh, what am I going to take from this? Well, definitely reading some of these other authors and seeing how they approach it in terms of the speculation piece, pulling out some either novels or memoirs where writers have done a good job of talking about emotion, describing emotion, and kind of analyzing that piece. And then, like I said, going back to Brené Brown and pulling out that Atlas of the Heart.
Well, Deborah, I can't wait to see how this opens things up for the essays that you're working on. And I can't wait to hear what happens with your querying process. It is a very exciting and daunting time for all of us. I know that personally. So I always end with 3 speed round questions that I'm going to ask you. So, what is the best piece of writing advice you've received?
One of the best things is remember your why and start
Mm,
with your reader in mind.
I love that. And how do you nurture your resilience?
Journaling is a big way for me. It's been an important healing practice for me and a place to reflect and process the thoughts and emotions that do arise.
And what's the best way for someone to connect with you if they want to learn more about you or more about your project?
Yeah, the best way would be through my website. It's Deborah Svec-Carstens, which is all one word.com. And you can sign up for my newsletter there. And I have links to my social media there as well. And just read more about me and what I'm doing.
Beautiful. And so, if you want to connect with Deborah, you will find that also in the show notes. Well, thank you so much, Deborah, for being on the podcast. It is a deep honor for me to have you, a member of my newsletter community, on today. And I am so excited for you and your upcoming journey.
Thank you so much. This has been a real pleasure. I appreciate it.
Are you a writer who struggles with doubts? Do you wonder if your stories are good enough? Do you wish you had some simple tricks that would make the writing life just a little bit easier? Become part of my Writing and Resilience community by signing up for my newsletter. As a thank you, you'll receive a free copy of Write More, Fret Less, 5 brain hacks that will supercharge your productivity, creativity, and confidence. The link is in the show notes. That's it for today's episode. Before you leave, I would love your help spreading the word about this podcast. You can do this in a few very simple ways. Click on the subscribe button in the upper right-hand corner, then leave a 5-star review. You can also let me know what you think or share ideas for the podcast by connecting with me on Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, or through my Writing and Resilience newsletter, which you can have delivered directly to your inbox.